Hey everyone, welcome to episode 1 of A Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. On today's episode, we introduce the podcast and get people ready for the run itself. On this podcast, we discussed the history behind Dan, his blog, his stories, and all of the things that we'll be covering over the length of this weekly podcast.
So this was our first podcast with him. Do you feel like this was a good introduction to the basics of what his career and professional life were made out of?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as his children. Mm-hmm. Oh, and we should introduce ourselves. Mm-hmm. I'm Asher Feldman,
and
his
I'm
son.
Leah Feldman, his daughter.
Yeah, so as we know, he's got a set of stories that he likes to tell. And he certainly tells some of those stories on this episode. But it was really good to kind of hear his progression of thinking as to why he wants to start a podcast, why he wants to kind of tell these stories, and what he's hoping to accomplish that he wasn't able to accomplish with the books or with his blog or anything that he's done previously.
Well, great. I look forward to hearing this one.
Cool. So enjoy episode 1 of A Good Run, and we'll see you next week. Everybody to the first episode of A Good Run podcast with Dan Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman, and we're going to get started with a quick introduction into the entire concept. So thanks for showing up for the first episode of the podcast.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, the idea here is to take a different approach to chronicling your stories. I know that you had started a blog. I was heavily involved in that blog originally. And I think that the content was really good. I think that the real important thing that I wanted to do here was to encapsulate it in a different way and maybe even a more approachable way. So I wonder if you could talk really quickly about the kind of the approach that you took to the blog, how you saw it recepted, what was the feedback that you got, and really maybe just from the beginning, what was the idea in starting the blog and how it evolved over time.
Okay. All right. Well, essentially, I spent almost 50 years in some way or another in New York politics. Not just New York. I mean, there's some excursions out of the state as well. But from the vantage point of at least a self-perceived reformer, that is a Reform Democrat, and that is it was a perspective on part of political history, which I think is of use to other people in the sense that, first of all, it's history, and some pieces of that history, I can say for certain will get lost. It would get lost in the absence of the blog or the podcast. In that, some of the things, my own experiences, which nobody else had, obviously. Some of them were experiences that were related to me by other people who are very old or dead by now. So again, they would otherwise be lost. But in addition to the history, there are certain perceptions which come from experiences in politics that I think are applicable to, that help people understand politics today as well. So, in addition, it was arranged not only over a long period of time, but also in a lot of different contexts. I had by sheer accident, I happened to have been involved in political efforts in 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City, in Massachusetts, in Indiana, and Florida. In presidential campaigns and gubernatorial campaigns. I mean, a whole different level of things. And of course, my own campaigns. I was elected and reelected a number of times. So I'd like to think that these stories are potentially useful to people. And also, at least in my opinion, some of them are kind of amusing too. So
yeah,
I think people might enjoy hearing them. So that's the general idea.
Right. So when you started the blog, what was the feedback that you got from it?
Well, I did not get thousands of hits.
That's totally fine.
But I got, it was interesting. I did get a number of responses. dozens. I don't know. I don't think it was hundreds, but although I don't, maybe there were hundreds of hits. I don't know.
Yeah.
But in any case, I got some nice feedback. Some from people who I mentioned,
Yeah.
of course, who had interesting things to say. In one case, at least, attempting to correct my recollection. But then a few people argued with some of my conclusions, which I liked, which I enjoyed. I liked the back and forth. I thought the responses to it were pretty substantial and helpful.
Yeah, from a personal perspective, was it cathartic? Was it helping your recollection, kind of spicing up new thoughts in your mind? Like, what was the experience for you just telling these stories again after all these years?
Well, to be very frank,
Yeah.
I liked the fact that somebody was interested in them.
Yeah.
I enjoyed that. I like the fact that people responded. And once, I got a few things from strangers, I guess people who were Googling things and up popped my blogs.
Yeah.
And it was useful to some of these people who were researching something or other. And that was gratifying. I was happy to see that.
What were they researching? Was it news articles? Was it research papers? Was it theses?
Mostly, I think, journalists who were doing articles about prominent elected officials who I had mentioned in the blogs.
Do you feel like some of the stories that you were telling are documented anywhere else, or are these the kinds of stories that might get lost if nobody were recollecting them in the way that you were?
I think for the most part, they would get lost otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Even though some of them are about pretty prominent people.
Yeah, and people who may be still prominent or well regarded and or well known in today's kind of political landscape.
True. Yeah.
Interesting. So in that case, what have you seen, I guess, since you ended your time in the political sphere directly? How have you seen the kind of stories that people are telling? How have you seen that scope of the stories change since then? Or has there been a change in the scope of the stories that people tell?
I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that.
Yeah.
I think, frankly, for the past year, I've been so focused on the presidential race, as have most people, that I've kind of lost track of. I mean, the only presidential race that I have a lot of stories about is one from a long time ago where things were so different than they are now. Although, I guess, what's the difference? Plus ça change, plus ça reste la même chose. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, in some ways, some things always stay the same in politics. But I don't think I have a really good answer to that question.
Do you think that there was ever a time when the level of politics, the level of local politics that you're talking about, statewide or even local, was as prominent or as important to people as it is in your own mind? Like, do you feel like people ever truly paid attention to the local, granular politics?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And do you think they still?
Most people don't. But it's hard to say. I mean, one of the things I talk about in one of the blogs is it's ironic. One of the things that people who consider themselves reformers like myself, one of the things we opposed was the strong party system which was so dominant and often very corrupt. But in fact, that strong party system enlisted and enrolled the efforts of large numbers of citizens.
Yeah.
And to the extent that that system was weakened, the vacuum, vacuums don't stay unfilled. The vacuum that was left was filled by media, by money, by demagoguery on a large scale. I mean, for example, just to pull it into the present, there's no way on earth Donald Trump would have been able to get the nomination had the Republican Party still been dominated by the political machine. The various power brokers would have taken one look at this guy and said, "Are you kidding? I'm not going to back this guy."
Right.
So now I'm not saying that the political machine was necessarily a good thing, but in a sense, is be careful what you wish for. The result of having gotten rid of it for the most part has not been all good, to put it mildly.
Right.
So.
That's fascinating. I mean, I wonder if anything that you experienced was in some way, shape, or form the beginnings, the rumblings of the kind of political landscape that we know to be the case today. Do you think that you saw it moving this direction?
Oh yes, absolutely. This is I'm pulling now from some of the stories I told in the but when I first, well, you can go much further. When I was a kid, the political organization where I grew up in Rockaway was quite strong. They had jobs to hand out. One of the funnier ones, which is why I talked about it. There was the city of New York had this part-time assignment, which was called a pothole inspector, and for I think it was $5,000 a year, you were responsible for calling into the Department of Transportation any potholes that you and your car encountered on the street. And these assignments were the purview were delegated to the Democratic political organizations, because the city, New York City, was totally dominated by Democrats. But the New York City regular Democratic organizations who would reward, assiduous, reliable volunteers by giving them these little jobs. Only sometimes you get only half a hole inspectors. You get $2,500 a year you get half of it to report these things. And I was very well aware of this. At one point, very early on, when my mother still had connections to the regular organization, and my dad was having some financial problems, she got half a hole inspector job from my father. By the time I ran for office in Brooklyn, we'll leave aside whenever, in Queens, I'm not sure how much change had been by then, but by the time I ran for office for the first time in Brooklyn, things had changed, but not that much. I mean, there were no more hole inspector jobs as far as I knew, but there was still very strong what we used to call captains. These were people in the political organization who could be counted on to bring in 100, 200, 300, sometimes 500 votes in a Democratic primary. By the time I left office, there were no such people. Mm-hmm. The party organization had deteriorated to the point it was gone. Now, I don't mean that's not true entirely across the board. There was still some parts of the city, some parts of Brooklyn where, generally the poorer sections, where this still existed to some extent. But it used to be across the board. And by the time I left elective office, by and large, and with exceptions, by and large, it had disappeared. So I saw that change. Mm-hmm. And what replaced it again was the people either with their own money or who could raise enough money to advertise if it was a big enough race on TV, if not to buy campaign assistance. But the old standard political organizations had withered very much.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, what does that do to the ordinary citizen's interest, exposure to politics?
Well, actually, I have to go a little deeper to answer that question properly. I'm now at the risk of scaring people off with some real history, but prior to the New Deal, the quote poverty programs unquote. I mean, the way that people related, or that many people related to the political organization, was if the breadwinner in a family, in those days, of course, mostly the husband, lost the job, and you were a loyal member of the local Democratic club, the club might, give you a shipment of coal for the winter. In those days, people used coal, so you wouldn't freeze to death, or, a Christmas turkey, or even a job, possibly, if you were a good enough and strong enough soldier in the political machine.
Right.
In the New Deal, with the advent of Social Security and other programs that were some kind of safety net for poor people, that was the political clubs no longer played as much of a role in that regard, although, as I said earlier, you could still get a home inspector position, and obviously at the higher level, the lawyers who worked for the clubs got, judicial, became secretaries to judges, and maybe eventually became judges, and so on and so forth. But clearly it wasn't as widespread as at that time. But the habits persisted, so that even though the clubs didn't have the clout that they had before the New Deal, the structure and the habits persisted, so that you still had loyal club workers who they couldn't expect the same financial rewards, but for the most part, but they had the habit, and so these captains still were loyal, maybe remembering what the system had done for them 30 years earlier, I don't know.
Right.
Or just imagining, or somehow that was the culture. But it faded, because the economic end of it largely faded, and then eventually the social end faded too. That's not to say that, to this day, the political clubs control the judgeships for the most part, but that's a very elevated level. That doesn't affect the majority of citizens.
Got it. So, from your perspective, changing gears a little bit, I know that obviously you're a professor now, John Jay.
Right.
Do you feel like, and you're partially responsible for shaping young minds, do you feel like anyone in, I would guess, my generation is aware of the scope of things as your generation was aware of the scope of things, at least politically?
I don't think I understand the question. What do you mean? What do you mean by the scope?
Well,
of
so you're talking about how things have changed as far as the way that the political organization has shifted, the power's been distributed. People who are able to support themselves politically are now engendered with the ability to do so. Yeah. But do you think that the average person of my generation, millennials, people in their 20s, 30s, even pushing 40, are we as aware of the way that the system ebbs and flows, changes and shifts over time?
Well, obviously, there's no reason for younger people to be aware of the things that happened a long time ago. But I think they're, I don't know that they're less aware of what's going on now than we were at our time. People are, they look at the outpouring of young people supporting Bernie Sanders. Look at even before that, I'm not sure how widespread Occupy Wall Street was, or on the other side, the Tea Party, the Trump people. There are a lot of energized people in this regard. I'm not sure whether it's more or less than it was before.
Now, do you think, obviously an old saying, if you don't know your own history, you're doomed to repeat it. Do you think that there is anything to be learned from your tenure in politics, or even in the immediate aftermath of your tenure in politics? Is there anything to be learned from that portion of time that could be applicable now?
Well, if my answer is no, there's not much point going on with the podcast.
Exactly. But I would imagine your answer is yes.
Well, I would hope so. They're in some ways, politics is just, in my view, a distillation or an intensified version of life.
Right.
And so I think the most important lessons are those that are just really about human nature. Mm-hmm. And human nature hasn't changed all that much as far as I can tell. Yeah. So I think, the stories are most directly applicable to politics, but there's stories of how human nature drives politics. And it always will, and it still does. And so I think it's applicable in that regard.
Yeah, interesting. So, politics is life. Life is politics.
Right.
In your life, do you think that your life itself has been influenced by your politics, or vice versa?
Well, yeah. How could it not?
How could it not
be? But in two ways. One, that I voluntarily got involved in politics, of course, so it took up a lot of my time and energy in life. Yeah. And two, the larger politics of the society, of course, influenced me as they influenced everybody. It shapes everybody's life.
Yeah, so, obviously a lot of people aren't directly involved in politics.
Yeah.
They have a fascination with it. They have a
Right.
passing
Right.
interest in it, or they may be politically active, not necessarily elected.
Right.
From just a generalist's point of view, do you feel like the way that you lived your life was heavily influenced by what you saw in the political sphere, or was there anything?
Hell yes. I mean, it was from a pretty early age. It shaped my life for sure.
Can you give me an example?
When I was about, let's see, five or six. This is one of my earliest political memory. It probably is my earliest political memory. I was trying to talk to my mother about something, and she said, "Shh, this is important." She was watching the Army McCarthy hearings on television when Joseph Welch finally confronted Joe McCarthy. When McCarthy was making these ridiculous and horribly damaging false allegations about communists. In the Army at that point, and Welch said, "At long last, sir, have you no shame? Have you no decency?" So, as a little kid, what was my message? This political stuff is important,
Yeah.
Then I went to a really good public elementary school where we not only read the Times every morning, but we were required to write letters to the editor to the Times every day, and so I read it. And in like 5th grade or 6th grade, I was reading about, some of the horrible things that were being done to black people in the South. And I remember quite distinctly this rage sort of welling up in me, like from my toes coming up to my, just fury about this stuff. And thinking at that point, I want to be in a position to do something about stuff like that. Now, of course, there are many ways to fight it, but somehow for me, it seemed, elective office in politics would be give me the most freedom to fight against injustice of that sort. So it absolutely shaped my life entirely from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then just generally, when I was a kid, our dinner table conversation was almost always about politics and public policy, even though neither one of my parents was professionally involved in that.
Right. So, that's an interesting point. So neither one of your parents are professionally involved in politics. Right. They obviously have a strong interest in the political groups. They have obviously an interest in what's happening in the world.
Right.
As you said, your mother had some connections.
Yeah, she was a volunteer, a very, very energetic volunteer.
Right. So from that perspective, seeing your parents interested but not necessarily directly involved, how does a 5 or 6-year-old reading or seeing something on television, or a small child reading a newspaper in class, come to the realization that they need to be an elected official? They need to be directly involved in it in order to facilitate the change that they're looking to accomplish?
It's a good question. A very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer.
Well, what was the mental calculus that you went through to get there?
Let me throw one other piece into the thing. It's one more psychological piece that may help explain it to myself as well as everybody else. Remember, I was born shortly after World War II.
Right.
And so the other sort of omnipresent thing, big psychological factor in the lives of probably a lot of people like me was, I just thought of two factors. One big factor would have been the Holocaust,
right.
And the idea that, Jews were fairly powerless and got oppressed. So perhaps there was a notion that getting some political power might help protect me and my people, in that regard. The other thing, just flash forward a couple of years to 1960, or actually, 60, or January 61 at the inauguration, when John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And so, Kennedy certainly inspired a whole generation of people to get involved. And because he himself was a politician and so admired, I think that it was a role model also. I want to be like John Kennedy. Let me get elected to office and do good things.
Right. Would you say that, I mean, obviously John Kennedy being young or younger
Yes.
at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Eisenhower was to somebody like me, Eisenhower was this really old man, you know, who was, and the history, I think, has shown in retrospect, he was actually a pretty good president. But at the time, you know, he seemed like this sort of fumbling guy. He was not a good speaker. He was not charismatic. He was not, I mean, he may have been as a general, but as a president, somebody, I think, Mad Magazine or something once referred to his speeches as lumpy like an unmade bed. I mean, it was, you know, speeches were, you know, Kennedy, this young, handsome, charismatic. It was like the Barack Obama of his day, and you know, it was really inspiring.
So would you say, other than John Kennedy, who were some of your early, I guess, teenage, preteen, leading up to college, who were some of your other political idols, if you had any?
None. I think it was just John Kennedy. There were other people in politics who I liked, but nobody liked Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy was, you know, far and away. Well, we were Stevenson people. My mother had campaigned for Adlai Stevenson, who was an intellectual and a very impressive figure. And he campaigned for him in 52 and 56, and I campaigned for him in 56 when I was 7 years old, handing out leaflets for him. And he was again a candidate in 1960. And he was our candidate until my mother met John Kennedy. And although my mother was a very intelligent, very sophisticated woman, I don't think it was a purely intellectual response.
Fair enough.
She met John Kennedy and came home and said, "We're for Kennedy."
So it was pretty much like wrapped your entire family, like a Kennedy fascination.
I mean, we were very strong Stevenson supporters, and Stevenson did really engendered very strong loyalty among intellectuals, and who I guess my mother, although she was not a college graduate, was a high school graduate, nonetheless was an intellectual, and of course that goes to the great Stevenson story when he's campaigning at some factory, and the factory worker says, you know, Mr. Stevenson, you will have the vote of every intelligent American. And he said, that's not enough. I want to win. But in any case, that once Kennedy came on the scene, I mean, that was that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, what we're trying to do here a little bit is lay the foundation for your own.
Yeah. So I think, so the influence of my parents in sending the message of politics is important. The influence on me of reading about, you know, horrible stuff that seemed like gross injustice that I wanted to do something about. The influence of the Holocaust in sending the message that you ought to get some power to protect yourself. The influence of, especially the influence of Kennedy, and that you know, elective office is a route to serving your country. You know, and also I have to say that I think we were, and I am, a very loyal American in the sense that, you know, and the Holocaust contributed to that too, you know, but for the United States, I probably wouldn't even exist because my ancestors would be dead,
right? You
know, so that sense of loyalty to the United States and wanting to do something for one's country was really a big factor.
Yeah. Was there anything else that you think influenced your early political moldings?
I'm struggling to come up with these things. I'm not sure what else there probably were, but who knows?
Right.
It's, you know, one's own psychology is such a complex thing.
All right. So, I mean, I think as we kind of wrap down here, is there anything that you're hoping to get out of this exercise that maybe you didn't get out of the exercise of blogging, or among any of the books that you've written, any of the political experiences in telling stories that you've had thus far? Is there anything you're hoping to kind of gain here?
Well, a couple things. First, I think this format, this talking format, is more personal. You know, your tone of voice gets communicated where it doesn't if you're writing. So I'm hoping to communicate it. Communicate better to a potential audience than I did before on that basis. And secondly, perhaps remember things for myself that I didn't, because I now have an interlocutor. You know, I have somebody interviewing me, and that may prompt recollections that I otherwise wouldn't have had.
Right. All right. Well, I think we're all looking forward to seeing that exactly happen. That's the idea here.
Okay.
So we'll get started with specific stories moving forward. Every week we're hoping to deliver something that's new, something that's unique, something that you have particular insight on, and see what happens from there.
Excellent. Thank you.
Cool. Let's do it.